Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now, if you follow any kind of film websites or YouTube channels, you cannot fail to have come across a row that has broken out in the last couple of months about James Cameron. Now, James Cameron has been supervising some of his releases of his old movies on 4K, and fans are upset about them. They don't look right. What is happening is that James Cameron is applying new kind of AI technology to sort of clean up the image of these old films and put them on a parity to make them look similar to how movies look now. And fans are getting upset about it. They say, well, this isn't how the film originally looked to audiences in the past. You should be restoring them to how they looked back then. And the question is, does this matter? James Cameron clearly thinks the answer is no. He's told all of these nerds like me to go back to their mum's basement, which I thought was hilarious, right? And all these fans have gone, what? James Cameron's insulting us. It's a bit mean of James Cameron when you think that actually these fans are getting upset because they love the films that James Cameron made. I mean, they're actually saying, Jim, we love your movies and we want to keep them as they are. We want to preserve them. And Jim's telling them to sod off. Why does it matter? Do most people notice? Do most people really notice changes in the grain? People are always going on about grain, aren't they? The graininess of movies. Do people really care about the cinematography or the look of the picture? Most people don't, do they? They don't know anything about aspect ratios. Every time I mention the words aspect ratio, they say, Mike, what's an aspect ratio? Then I tell them, and then they think I'm an idiot. I'm not even going to bother to explain it. You should know. Right, so people think, what are you talking about? I just like the story, I like the characters. Who cares? And most people think that it's very easy to transfer a film onto a disc or onto streaming. They think it's just a simple process. You play it in, you're done. It isn't. It's actually very, very complex because what you're doing is you're transferring one medium to another, and they are not actually compatible. One is a physical medium on celluloid, which was projected, and the other is a digital medium. And digital, as this was seen in the early stages of DVDs and so on, is not very good, actually, at capturing the physical texture of film, right? This is the heart of the problem. And what the argument is about how we've improved and got as close an approximation as we can to the original film. And that's the key word, right? Whenever anyone talks about a transfer of a film to a DVD or a restoration, there is no such thing as a definitive version. This is the key thing you have to understand, right? You can only ever have an approximation. You can only ever have an approximation to how the film looked originally. We can never really get back to that because of various factors. The film negative may have deteriorated. Certain little snippets may have been lost. Things might have gone out of sync with the soundtrack. You can only ever have an approximation. I realised this when, where I used to work, there was a small department of film remastering, right? So our company did work for a little DVD label called Renown. And they used to specialise in doing DVDs of old British thrillers and forgotten movies from the 50s. And I had this friend of mine, and he was a restorer. And one day he showed me how it worked, right? He took me down, and he had this little movie called Grand National, I think it was called. It was like somewhere about 1950, and it was a thriller set in and around the Grand National horse race. And he had the job of remastering it. So what they do is they get these big canisters of film, these old canisters of film, like they're falling apart. They put them in this machine, this big spool machine. They spool it up. It runs through, and that plays the film, and it gets captured on digital. Then what happens is, it's great. So my friend sits down at this desk, and it's like something out of Star Trek. It's like a sort of Captain Kirk style desk. It's like this thing all around him with all sorts of buttons and flashing lights. And he's got this sort of little round knob where he moves the film forwards and backwards, right? And he goes through the film. And it's like an artist at work. So he'll look at the first shot. Is it too dark? Is it too light? What did the cameraman intend? He might lighten it a bit. Then he goes to the next scene, but then he sees that this scene is kind of overlit. So then he thinks, well, is there an average? Or is this a choice of the lighting? You see the problem? We don't actually know. Everything is an approximation. It's a judgment that must be taken by someone who knows about film, who's educated in film, who's sensitive to film. It's not a simple transposition from one medium to another. It takes a lot of work, a lot of homework, right? He's got to go through every bit of the film, making judgments on lighting, contrast, etc. And then he'll learn, like there might be a scene half an hour in, where he thinks, that's a sort of key scene that I can work from because everything seems to be perfect. And it's that image, the celluloid at that point is much stronger. So I can go from that and I can key that back into all the other images. But you see what I mean? It's a judgment call. A very difficult one. It's an artistic thing. And so when these films are restored by laboratories, there's so much work going into that. They've got to think about colour grading. They've got to think about what's the right source. Are there any bits that are cut? The amount of homework that goes into it, what you realise is it can only ever be an approximation. So, let's go back. Does it really matter? Does it really matter what the film looks like? I want to try and show you what I mean by this by looking at two other mediums. Let's go off on a tangent, right? Let's forget film for a second. And let's look at two other mediums. Let's start with painting. Now, when I was growing up, I was a huge fan of the American painter Edward Hopper. Hopper was famous for his sort of urban nighttime scenes, people, huddled over coffees in diners, or lonely in a room looking out onto the streets, these kind of twilight scenes of urban New York or whatever. And I thought they were beautiful and mysterious and enigmatic, and I loved them. And Tate Modern in London did a huge retrospective. They did a huge exhibition of Hopper. And I was really excited. I booked my ticket and went along. And I got a bit of a shock. Because when I saw the paintings in real life, they were very matte. They were very there wasn't much use of paint. There wasn't much three-dimensionality in the use of the brush strokes. They were very linear brush strokes. Very boring. They didn't come off the canvas. I was very disappointed. And what I realised was I'd grown used to Edward Hopper through representations of the paintings, through prints. And prints give you a very different perception. They're very sort of shiny, there's no three-dimensionality, it's just the image, right? Here's a print, right? I bought this from the National Gallery very recently. And it's by Sargent, a wonderful painting by Sargent. Now, I've got it in its wrapping, but you can see there's no three-dimensionality. There's a sheen to the image, right? I realised that reproduction of Hopper I preferred to the actual paintings, which didn't come out. That my relationship with a three-dimensional object didn't work. I realised that Hopper was not actually a very interesting painter. He didn't use brushstrokes in a very interesting way. I preferred the prints, right? I wonder, in a way, whether that's what's happening with these younger people coming to Aliens or True Lies or whatever it is, whatever a Cameron film is for the first time, without seeing the original on film, right? So if you go back and watch Aliens, Aliens has got very gritty, raw, grungy, blocky kind of cinematography, which I think adds to the rawness of the film, the raw energy of the film. Cameron is sort of cleaning that away and making it a more plastic surface. But the real Aliens, therefore, is being obscured. Now, let me come to another example, right? The world of television. Back in the 1960s, the BBC made Doctor Who, this series that would become a great iconic sci-fi series. But by the end of the decade, they started junking the episodes, because in those days no one had a video recorder and TV was thought to be ephemeral. No one's going to watch it ever again. So they started wiping the videos so that they could record other programs on it. So loads of episodes were lost. And the hunt began by fans to try and track down these episodes. Now, there was a problem. The problem was this, that in the 1960s, the BBC filmed Doctor Who, as they film most of their television programmes, on videotape. Now, videotape gives a very immediate, plasticky image, right? You're sort of there in the TV studios with the glaring lights, right? But when they sold these episodes on to other countries, they copied them onto film, onto 16mm film, which is grainier and gives an image that seems more distant somehow, right? They did this because not all the countries or the territories they sold to had videotape equipment. So they put it onto film. So all the episodes of Doctor Who that went out were all on film. Now, these episodes have been lost in the UK, mostly. But fans realised they could go out to other countries like the US and Canada, like New Zealand and Australia, Nigeria, Hong Kong. These episodes have turned up in all sorts of places, right? They'd find them, the sold episodes, but these episodes were on film. So they had a different texture to the normal episodes. Enter a genius called Peter Finkelstein and the Doctor Who restoration team, this amazing group of fans who devoted all their energies to bringing Doctor Who back to almost as far as they could to how it was originally seen on television. And Finkelstein came up with this amazing piece of technology. It was called vidfire. And the idea was to do the opposite of what I'm talking about in this video. In this video, we're trying to make a digital disc give a strong impression, right, of cinematic grain and cinematic texture. They were doing the opposite. They were taking a film and trying to make it back into a piece of television. So they added more lines of definition, right? They changed the movement and they made it look like a television program. Now, I can tell you, when this first happened in the late 90s, I saw the results of it, and this was not just something that nerds would notice. It was mind-blowing. It was like the episodes, these old episodes that were 25 years old, it was like they'd been made yesterday. The immediacy of being there in the studio was incredible, right? Only the fact that they were black and white gave it away, that they weren't modern, made yesterday episodes. It was incredible, right? So it's a kind of irony that this was the reverse process. But the important point is that you could tell, and it was important. You were seeing these Doctor Who episodes for the first time in 20 years, how they were originally shown. Now, a few years later, I bought this on Blu-ray, right? La Grande Illusion, a famous classic by Jean Renoir from the 1930s, absolutely terrific film. And it was a brand spanking new restoration. Everyone was saying how great it was. I put it on my DVD player and I got a shock. Because here was this film, this great masterpiece of cinema made in the 30s on celluloid, and it looked like vidfire. The movement was the movement of video. I felt that rather than watching a set in a film, I was in a TV studio and the actors were moving in a studio. It felt wrong. The film was still there, all the themes, the stories, the characterization, but the film looked wrong. And that's important because my relationship to it is different. Your relationship to a film and the way it's shot is very different from your relationship to a TV program and the way it's shot. For me, this was not a good restoration because it had made the film seem modern instead of its time. Now, all of us have seen DVDs where they've gone a bit crazy about the grain, haven't they? And like, I bought a Blu-ray version of Silent Running, you know, the famous science fiction film with Bruce Dern and the little robots. And the grain on that was so intense and visible that it took my mind off the film. It was annoying. But then you see when they get it right. If any of you have bought the recent Radiance Films version of L'amour fou by Jacques Rivette, and if you haven't, go and buy it because it's one of the greatest films ever made. But they've got that absolutely right in that transference. You can see it. The film was deliberately shot originally on quite grungy, quite grainy film work. and they've captured it while still keeping the beauty and the limpid quality of the cinematography. So you're watching a film from the 60s, but it's cleaned up so that you can see it and its beauty comes out at you without losing any of its original style and feel. That's why it does matter. It does matter that we see Aliens as it was originally shot. It's part of the artwork. You can't just change the whole visual, the whole patina of the screen and say, oh, well, it doesn't change the film, doesn't change the story. In that print, we don't see any of the three-dimensionalities of the artwork. If we were in the gallery, the light falls, like there might be patches of white on her dress, which is highlighted, and the paint comes up in a strong brushstroke. We see that three-dimensionality, it draws us into the painting. You lose that, you have a nice reproduction, but that's all it is. It's just a reproduction. It isn't the complete work of art as Sargent painted it. And that's what we're losing by Cameron messing around these 4K versions. I'd like to make a final point about this that's very important. The real point here is this: who owns these films? The way Cameron talks, it's as though I own these films and I can do what the bloody hell I like to them because it's my work. Does he own the films? Well, technically, of course, he doesn't, right? The owners of films, especially in the commercial cinema world, are not the directors, they're the producers, they're the financiers, the people who put the money in. They're the people who go up and collect the Oscar for film. They are the owners, they made it, it's their production, right? The director is an employee. So technically, Cameron is not the owner of these films anyway. But there's another point here. Who else owns the films? We do. We own them. The moment a work of art is released for public consumption, it becomes part of the public's memory. It becomes part of their culture. It's not just an entertainment. You know, Aliens, for example, is a huge part of my life. I love that film. It's a part of my memory. It's a part of my thinking. Why does Cameron feel that he has the right to take that away and change it? What about my ownership? What about our ownership? You know, we've kind of got ourselves stuck in a groove of thinking that one person, it's a very capitalist way of looking at things, isn't it? One person owns this product and can change it at will and stuff us if we don't like it. You know, compare this, for example, to the way that Blade Runner has been treated over the years. Now, those of us who grew up in the 80s and saw the film first on its first release, we saw the much derided studio cut with the voiceover and the ending from The Shining, right? And then along came the director's cut, which is much better, and then along came the definitive cut in the 2000s, which I have my issues with. But at no point did Scott or the makers prohibit us from seeing all of these versions. I'll show you this over here. Just move that Cyberman out of the way. Sorry, mate. Look at this. Look at this massive box set which contains 5 different versions of the film. And these have been widely available from the beginning, right? If Cameron wants to rejig the film for his taste, fine, as long as the original is there for us to enjoy. This was the argument that Star Wars fans made when Lucas changed his films horribly in the 1990s. Okay, as long as we have the originals, because those originals are part of us. We own them. And this leads me on to a second point, which is this. You'll notice that I own a lot of DVDs. I'm a physical media guy and I'm a passionate advocate of it. Now you might think this is a bit strange. I've just said this DVD didn't really replicate the film as it should have been replicated. So why am I arguing for DVD? I'm arguing because of this business of ownership, right? Recently, it was last year I think, fans of the film The French Connection by William Friedkin, it had been streamed onto the Criterion channel in the US and it was cut. The N-word had been cut actually. And there was complaints. It turned out that Criterion had leased the rights from another company and had no control over that censorship. They didn't even really notice it had happened, right? This shows you the problem with streaming. There is no curatorship. You have no ownership. You can't determine what is on there and what isn't, what's taken off and what's not, what's censored and what isn't, right? And there's no curatorship. They can just bang on a film, they don't know what version it is, they don't know what state it's in, they just chuck it on and then take it off a few months later. And then you've got no power in this whatsoever. The reason why so many of us still stick to this is because now, if anyone produces a disc, they have to curate it because that they know the people they're selling it to care. They're a caring and knowledgeable audience that can call them out if they're not giving us the right version of the film, or it's not in the right quality, not in the right aspect ratio, etc. We are a caring, knowledgeable audience. And therefore, people producing a disc have got to put a lot of love and care into what they produce. It guarantees quality. For example, the reason why a lot of people still own vinyl and own record players is because now, every time a vinyl record is produced, you know it's being produced by someone like you who really cares about the music and has put a lot of effort into creating something beautiful, a work of art in itself, for you to buy. That's why people still have physical media, and that's why I'm still a huge advocate of it. Because you know that what you're buying is well curated, and you know that you have ownership of it. You can keep it. You will always have that film. It can never be censored or taken away from you. Well, that's my little rant. I'm not massively angry at James Cameron. His comment about the mum's basement still amuses me no end. But there is an important subject to be discussed here. It's not just a bunch of spotty nerds having a bit of a rant. If you're interested in the nitty-gritty of DVDs and Blu-rays, I can recommend a very good YouTube channel, The Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader. I don't know why he calls himself that, but that's what he calls himself. He's really good at picking apart the nitty-gritty problems with DVD and Blu-ray releases. Also, Boutique Blu-ray in the UK is also very good at this stuff. But Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader, he's really gets down into the nitty-gritty of it, and he's very good. Though you might come away from some of his videos thinking, I can never watch a film again because I'll just be looking at the I'll just be looking at the images and listening to the sound, but he's very good. I think this does matter. I don't think it's just a matter for nerds, but even if it is just a matter for nerds, what's wrong with being nerdish? What's wrong with caring? What's wrong with caring about quality? What's wrong with wanting to preserve a work of art? We should be proud of being nerds. Poindexter. Anyway, see you next time.